She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just stood there, one hand on the counter, the other resting on her stomach, and said it in a voice so calm it scared me. The baby in my belly is yours. Morning light spilled across the kitchen tiles. 2 cups of tea sat untouched, the steam already gone. I remember the hum of the refrigerator, the way my heart started beating in my ears. I asked the only question that made sense to me, the question every man in my position would ask without thinking. So, will we get married now? She didn't answer. She stared past me, at the window, at something I couldn't see. And in that silence, longer than it should have been, heavier than it had any right to be, I realized this wasn't a love story. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, something that would follow me for years. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what I didn't know yet was that the truth about that baby would tear apart more than just 2 lives. 3 years earlier, my life was painfully ordinary. My name is Daniel, and at 39, I thought I had things figured out. I worked in logistics for a mid-sized company outside Columbus, Ohio. Nothing flashy. Early mornings, long commutes, coffee that always tasted burnt. I'd been divorced for 5 years, no kids, no real drama left behind. Just a quiet apartment and weekends that stretched too long. Then I met Claire. She laughed with her whole face, the kind of laugh that made other people turn around. She was a nurse, practical, warm, the sort of woman who remembered birthdays and returned shopping carts. We met at a charity run neither of us trained properly for, and afterward we sat on the curb eating bananas and talking about how tired we were. It felt easy, natural. 6 months in, she had a toothbrush at my place. A year later, she knew how I took my eggs, and I knew the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. Claire told me early on that marriage wasn't her priority. She'd seen her parents tear each other apart in court, and she wanted stability, not paperwork. I told her I was fine with that. And I was, or at least I thought I was. We talked about kids in that vague, someday way people do when they don't want to pressure each other. If it happens, she'd say, shrugging. I believed her. That's why the words in that kitchen hit me the way they did. They rewrote the past in seconds. Suddenly, every missed call, every late shift, every night she said she was too tired made my mind race. I watched her face, waiting for reassurance, for excitement, for fear even. Instead, there was distance. And when I asked her again, quietly this time, what she wanted to do, she said, I need time. 2 weeks later, she moved out. No argument. No slammed doors. Just boxes, a rented van, and a note taped to the fridge that said she needed space to think. I replayed everything in my head. Had I said something wrong? Had I waited too long to ask the question? I called, I texted, I left messages I later regretted. She replied once, a short message saying she was safe and asking me to respect her decision. That was it. 3 months later, I found out through a mutual friend that she'd transferred to a hospital 2 states away. I didn't know where she lived. I didn't know when the baby was due. I didn't even know if she still planned to keep it. Ask yourself honestly, what would you do in that position? Would you keep pushing, or would you tell yourself that maybe this was what she wanted all along? 6 months after she left, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a hospital wristband. The paper was a photocopy of a birth certificate application. The father's name section was blank. The date told me everything. She'd given birth 3 weeks earlier. My hands shook as I sat on the couch, staring at that empty line. Blank. Like I didn't exist. I called her immediately. This time, she answered. Her voice sounded older, tired. I asked the question I'd been holding back for months. Is the baby mine? There was a pause, then a sigh. I don't know, she said. I thought it was. Now I'm not sure. That sentence did something to me. It made the ground feel unstable. It made me question memories I was certain about. She told me she didn't want me involved until she had clarity. And then she hung up. What I didn't know then was that Claire had made a decision long before that phone call. A decision influenced by fear, by debt, and by advice from people who told her they were helping. Over the next year, I tried to move on. I dated. I worked more hours. I told myself that if the baby was mine, the truth would come out eventually. And it did, just not the way I imagined. A year and 4 months after that envelope arrived, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. It was from a woman named Susan, a social worker in another state. She asked if I was Daniel, if I had been involved with Claire, and if I would be willing to talk. My stomach dropped. We spoke that evening. She told me the baby had been placed for adoption shortly after birth. Closed adoption. No father listed. No contact allowed. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. All I could think was that somewhere out there was a child who might look like me, who would never know my name. Here's the part that still keeps me up at night. Claire never told me she was considering adoption. She never asked if I wanted to raise the child. She assumed my silence during those months meant I didn't care enough. I assumed her distance meant she wanted me gone. Two people making life-altering decisions based on fear instead of honesty. When I finally tracked her down months later, she cried for the first time since that kitchen morning. She told me she thought she was protecting everyone. She told me she was drowning financially, emotionally, mentally. The twist, the thing that changed everything, was the DNA test I pushed for afterward. The baby was mine, 100%. By then, the adoption was final, legal, irreversible. Years have passed since then. I still think about that child. I still wonder if they laugh the way I do, if they hate burnt coffee, if they feel like something is missing and don't know why. This isn't a story about villains. It's a story about silence, about assumptions, about how easily lives can be reshaped without cruelty, just fear. How many conversations do we avoid because they feel too heavy? How many truths do we delay until it's too late? If you were in my place, would you forgive? If you were in hers, would you believe you did the right thing? Let me know in the comments how this story made you feel, and whether you think some choices, even when made with good intentions, leave marks that never fully fade. Let me take you back. Before the kitchen. Before the words that changed everything. At that point in my life, I wasn't searching for anything new. I wasn't lonely in the dramatic sense. I was just settled. The marriage had ended years earlier, quietly, without shouting or betrayal, just two people realizing they'd grown into strangers. After that, I told myself I was done chasing milestones. No pressure, no urgency. I had routines I liked, evenings I understood, and a future that felt predictable enough to be safe. I honestly believe the hardest emotional chapters of my life were already behind me. I'd done the heartbreak. I'd done the rebuilding. What I wanted now was peace, not surprises. That's important to understand, because it explains why I let my guard down so completely. When you think your life is stable, you stop asking hard questions. You assume the ground beneath you won't shift. That's where Sarah came in. Sarah wasn't someone who arrived loudly or dramatically. She was familiar, comfortable, the kind of person who already felt like part of your life before you realized how close you'd become. We'd known each other casually for a long time, shared mutual friends, overlapping routines. She listened well. She remembered things I forgot I'd said. When she checked in on me, it didn't feel intrusive, it felt caring. She wasn't reckless or mysterious or impulsive, and that's why I trusted her. There was no sense of danger, no red flags waving in the air. If anything, she felt safe. Looking back, that's what makes this harder to process. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She was human, flawed, carrying her own quiet fears, making decisions in moments where clarity feels impossible. At the time, I believed our connection was simple and honest. Now, I know it was only simple on the surface. Because looking back, there were signs. Small ones, easy to dismiss. Little pauses in conversation. Answers that were technically correct, but emotionally vague. Dates that didn't quite line up if you thought about them too long. I remember moments where something fell off, just for a second, like a thought you brush away because you don't want to seem suspicious or ungrateful. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself trust meant not interrogating people you care about. But there was one detail about her timeline that didn't make sense yet. One thing I noticed, filed away, and chose not to examine. And that choice, more than anything else, is what made everything that followed possible. Sarah told me on a Tuesday evening, sitting across from me with her hands wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't touched. She said it plainly, almost clinically, like she'd rehearsed it enough times to remove the emotion. She told me she was just over 9 weeks along. Not maybe, but 9 weeks. She explained how she counted back, how she marked it on a calendar, how there was no overlap, no confusion in her mind. It can only be yours, she said softly, meeting my eyes for just a second before looking away. I felt my chest tighten, like the room had lost oxygen. My first reaction wasn't anger. It wasn't joy either. It was shock, the kind that makes everything sound distant. Then responsibility rushed in right behind it, heavy and immediate. I heard myself say, okay, even though my thoughts were racing. I wasn't angry. I was terrified. Terrified of getting this wrong. Terrified of stepping into something I couldn't undo. She kept talking, filling the silence with details, as if facts alone could steady both of us. She reminded me of the weekend we'd spent together, the one we never talked about afterward because it felt too intimate to label. She said she hadn't been with anyone else, not before, not after. Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers did. I noticed that. I noticed how she rubbed her thumb against the glass over and over again. My mind started doing math I didn't want to do, replaying nights, dates, gaps between conversations. Part of me wanted to interrupt, to ask 100 questions at once. Another part of me stayed quiet, afraid that if I spoke too soon, I'd say something irreversible. I remember thinking, this is how lives change, not with explosions, but with calm sentences spoken at the wrong moment. I nodded, listened, tried to look like a man who knew what he was doing, while inside I felt completely unprepared. As she talked about next steps, doctor visits, things she'd already looked up online, I felt the weight settle in. This wasn't abstract anymore. This wasn't a hypothetical future. There was a timeline now, dates that would keep moving forward whether I caught up emotionally or not. I thought about my quiet apartment, my routines, the life I believed was settled. I thought about how quickly responsibility can arrive without asking if you're ready. I didn't feel trapped, but I did feel cornered by time. Every option felt permanent in its own way. I asked myself if I could be the kind of man a child deserved, if stepping up meant sacrificing the parts of my life I'd only just rebuilt. And layered under all of that was a quieter fear I didn't want to admit yet, the fear of trusting something I couldn't fully verify without hurting someone I cared about. I asked careful questions, trying to keep my voice neutral. When did you find out? Who else knows? What do you want to do? She answered each one patiently, almost gratefully, like she was relieved I wasn't reacting emotionally. She said she hadn't told anyone else yet. She said she wanted to wait, to make sure she handled it the right way. When I asked what that meant for us, she hesitated. Just a second too long. I'm not asking you to decide everything right now, she said. I just needed you to know. That sentence stuck with me. Needed you to know. Not needed you to be involved. Not needed you to stay. Just to know. I told myself that was reasonable. People need time. Big news needs space. Still, a quiet unease settled in. The feeling that we weren't standing on the same emotional ground anymore. That night, after she left, I sat alone replaying the conversation. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel betrayed. What I felt was exposed, like a door inside me had been opened without warning. I wanted to do the right thing, whatever that was, but I wasn't sure how to define it yet. I thought about calling a friend, then decided against it. It didn't feel like my story to share yet. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of my place, realizing how unfamiliar my future suddenly felt. And then, just when I thought the shock had settled into something manageable, I remembered one small detail from earlier conversations, something she'd mentioned in passing weeks before. At the time, I dismissed it. Now it surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. And when I brought it up to her the next day, she said something that stopped me cold. The question came out of me quietly, almost cautiously, like I was testing the ground before putting my full weight on it. We were sitting in my car outside her place, engine off, the clock on the dashboard glowing faintly. I told her I wasn't asking out of panic or obligation, but because if a child was coming into the world, I believed in structure, in commitment, in showing up fully. I said marriage wasn't about appearances for me anymore. It was about building something solid so no one felt disposable. I asked her how she felt about that, about us becoming a family in the clearest way I knew how. She didn't answer right away. She stared straight ahead, breathing slowly, like she was choosing which truth to offer. That silence felt familiar now, and it landed harder than I expected. It wasn't rejection, not exactly, but it wasn't reassurance either. When she finally spoke, her words were careful, rounded at the edges. She said she didn't want to rush into something out of fear. She said marriage deserved joy, not pressure. She said she needed to protect her peace, especially now. None of those things were unreasonable on their own. In fact, if a friend had told me the same story, I might have defended her. But sitting there, hearing it directed at me, something didn't line up emotionally. I wasn't hearing excitement or relief, just distance wrapped in reasonable language. I asked if she saw a future together at all, and she said, I don't know yet. That phrase hung between us. Not no, not yes, just uncertainty. And suddenly, the pregnancy felt like a separate issue from our relationship, like two parallel tracks that weren't meant to meet. What stayed with me wasn't what she said, but what she avoided. She didn't ask what marriage meant to me. She didn't ask how I envisioned raising a child together. There was no curiosity, no shared imagining of a future. For me, trust had always been about transparency, about facing uncomfortable conversations head-on. Security wasn't just financial, it was emotional, knowing you weren't alone in decisions that shape lives. Family, in my mind, meant choosing each other even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. As I spoke, explaining that, she nodded politely, but her eyes drifted, as if she were already somewhere else. I remember wondering if she heard my words or just waited for them to end. That realization made my chest feel tight, like I was offering something that didn't fit where she was standing. I didn't push. I told myself pushing would only make things worse. I said we didn't have to decide anything that night. I said we could take time, talk more, figure it out together. She agreed quickly, almost with relief, and opened the car door before I finished my sentence. As she walked away, I felt a strange shift inside me, a quiet understanding I didn't yet have language for. This wasn't a disagreement about timing. It was a difference in how we defined responsibility. I was talking about building a shared foundation. She was talking about managing a situation. Both valid perspectives, but not the same conversation. And as I sat there alone, watching her door close, it became clear to me for the first time that we weren't standing on opposite sides of the same decision. We were standing in entirely different rooms, speaking through walls, each assuming the other understood. After that night, I started noticing the cracks. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the slow, unsettling way doubt creeps in when you're not looking for it. The timeline she'd been so confident about began to feel less solid the more I replayed it in my head. Dates that once felt clear now blurred at the edges. I caught myself counting weeks again, matching them against moments we'd shared, moments we hadn't. When I asked gentle follow-up questions, nothing accusatory, just clarifying, her answers came quickly, too quickly, like they'd been prepared ahead of time. The numbers stayed the same, but the explanations shifted slightly, just enough to make me pause. She never contradicted herself outright. It was subtler than that. It was the way her eyes flicked away before she spoke, the way she'd repeat the question back to me before answering, buying time. Emotionally, something changed too. Texts became shorter. Calls felt scheduled rather than spontaneous. When we were together, there was a politeness that hadn't been there before, as if we were carefully avoiding emotional bruises instead of leaning into honesty. She'd reassure me that everything was fine, that stress did strange things to people, that I was overthinking because I cared. And maybe she was right. I wanted her to be right. I reminded myself that pregnancy is overwhelming, that fear can make anyone guarded. Still, there was a growing sense that I was being kept at arm's length, close enough to be responsible, but not close enough to fully belong. That space between us felt intentional, even if I couldn't explain why. I hated myself for noticing, for questioning, for letting suspicion touch something that involved a child. I told myself that decent men don't doubt women in moments like this. That trust means believing even when it's uncomfortable. And yet, every time she spoke, I found myself listening not just to the words, but to the rhythm, the pauses, the emphasis. It felt less like conversation and more like recitation. I'd leave our time together feeling calm on the surface, then restless the moment I was alone. My intuition kept tapping at me quietly, insistently, like a warning I didn't want to hear. Something felt off, and I hated myself for thinking it. I didn't know it yet, but someone else already knew the truth. The details surfaced by accident, the way life-changing information often does, quietly and without ceremony. I wasn't searching for proof or trying to catch her in anything. I was just sitting in her living room while she stepped into the kitchen to take a call. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, lighting up with a message preview she must have forgotten to silence. I didn't read it at first. I told myself it wasn't my place. But then I saw the name. It wasn't familiar. And beneath it were words that didn't belong in my understanding of her story. Did the doctor confirm the new date? That was all it said. No context. No explanation. Just enough to make my stomach tighten. When she came back into the room, smiling like nothing had happened, I couldn't focus on anything she said. My mind kept circling that phrase. New date. I waited a day before bringing it up. I wanted to give myself time to calm down, to approach it like an adult, not someone ruled by fear. When I finally asked, casually, about her next appointment and what the doctor had said, she hesitated. Just long enough. Then she gave me an answer that sounded reasonable on the surface, but it didn't match what I'd seen. She said there hadn't been any changes, that everything was on track. I nodded, pretending that satisfied me. Inside, something shifted. This wasn't just confusion anymore. This was the possibility of emotional betrayal. If she was hiding information, it meant I wasn't part of the decision-making, even though my life was being rearranged around it. I started thinking about how this would look to friends, to family, to people who already knew bits and pieces of the story. I thought about legal responsibilities, about names on documents, about commitments that don't disappear just because the truth arrives late. A week later, the third-party mention came. A mutual acquaintance asked me, carefully, if everything was okay between Sarah and the other guy. I laughed it off instinctively, but the words echoed long after the conversation ended. When I pressed for clarification, the person backtracked, said they must have misunderstood, said it was probably nothing. But nothing doesn't lodge itself in your chest like that. I realized then that this story existed outside of me, that pieces of it were being shared without my knowledge, shaped without my voice. I felt exposed, like I'd agreed to play a role in a situation where the script kept changing. Ask yourself, if you were in my place, how long would you keep quiet? At what point does protecting someone else start to feel like betraying yourself? That night, I confronted her directly. No softness, no easing into it. I told her what I'd seen, what I'd heard, and how none of it aligned. For the first time, she didn't respond immediately. Her face drained of color. She sat down slowly, hands folded in her lap, and said she hadn't meant for things to get complicated. She admitted there were uncertainties she hadn't shared, conversations she'd avoided because she didn't want to lose control of the situation. Control. That word landed heavily. Because suddenly, this wasn't about a misunderstanding or stress. It was about choices. Choices that had put me in emotional, social, and legal territory I hadn't knowingly agreed to enter. That's when everything changed. When the truth finally surfaced, it didn't arrive as a single sentence. It came in fragments, reluctantly offered, like pieces of something she'd been holding together by sheer will. She told me there was another man. Not a stranger, not a passing mistake, but someone from her past who had re-entered her life briefly during a period she described as confusing and lonely. The timeline she'd given me wasn't false in her mind, she said. It was the version that felt safest to hold on to. The dates overlapped more than she'd admitted. The certainty she'd shown me was something she'd clung to because uncertainty felt unbearable. As she spoke, my emotions tangled into something I couldn't immediately name. There was shock, yes, but also shame, like I'd been foolish for believing without question. Fear followed close behind, the kind that makes you realize how close you are to consequences you didn't choose. I wanted to be angry. Part of me felt entitled to that. But what surfaced instead was confusion, a moral fog where every option felt wrong. If I walked away, I risked abandoning a child who might be mine. If I stayed, I risked building a life on ground that had already shifted. Sarah wasn't crying for sympathy. She was explaining herself in a voice stripped of defenses. She told me she'd been terrified of ending up alone, of becoming a story people whispered about, of navigating pregnancy without stability. She said when she looked at me, she saw safety, someone dependable, someone who wouldn't disappear. That admission hurt in a different way, not because it was cruel, but because it was human. She hadn't acted out of malice. She'd acted out of fear, making choices that narrowed her options until honesty felt too dangerous. As she talked, I saw her vulnerability clearly for the first time, not as an excuse, but as context. She wasn't manipulating for gain. She was grasping for security. That realization complicated everything. It didn't erase the breach of trust, but it made it harder to draw clean lines. I thought about how fear can push people into silence, how shame can reshape timelines, how the desire for stability can lead someone to convince themselves of a version of reality that feels survivable. I sat there wondering what responsibility looks like when truth arrives late. Is it measured by biology, by intention, by who shows up when it's hardest? And if you were in my place, standing at the edge of a decision that could define the rest of your life, what would you have done at this point? After that conversation, nothing felt solid anymore. The shock faded, but what replaced it was heavier, slower, and harder to escape. Trust didn't shatter all at once. It thinned, like fabric worn down by too much handling. Every interaction carried tension, not explosive, but constant. Words had weight now. Silence had even more. I found myself measuring everything she said against what I already knew, wondering what was missing instead of what was present. The future stopped feeling like something we were moving toward together and started feeling like a negotiation neither of us knew how to finish. The emotional closeness we once had was replaced by careful distance, as if we were both afraid that one wrong sentence would collapse whatever fragile structure remained. Responsibility became the loudest voice in my head. Not just responsibility to a potential child, but to truth itself. I asked myself what mattered more, stepping up in uncertainty or stepping back until clarity arrived. Love, if that's what this still was, felt tangled with obligation. I cared about her well-being, about her safety, about not abandoning someone in a vulnerable moment. But care without trust feels hollow, and obligation without honesty feels suffocating. I started to recognize how easily good intentions can trap people in roles they never consciously chose. I wasn't deciding whether to stay or leave anymore. I was deciding who I would become by either choice. And that question followed me everywhere, into sleepless nights, into conversations that ended with more questions than answers. We tried to keep moving forward in small, practical ways. Appointments were discussed. Plans were mentioned, then quietly adjusted. But something fundamental was missing. We weren't aligned in why we were doing any of it. I wanted truth, even if it hurt. She wanted stability, even if it meant postponing clarity. Neither desire was wrong, but they were incompatible. I began to realize that even if the baby turned out to be mine, the foundation we were standing on might not survive the weight of what had already happened. And as that understanding settled in, another realization emerged, one that was far more difficult to face. Because the hardest truth wasn't about the baby. The DNA test was the word neither of us wanted to say at first, but it hovered over every conversation like unfinished business. When I finally brought it up, my voice steady despite everything inside me shaking, she went quiet. Not defensive, not angry, just tired. She said she understood why I needed it, but hearing that need spoken out loud made everything feel more real. We talked about timing, about procedures, about how long results would take. It felt strange discussing something so clinical while emotions were still raw, but clarity had become a necessity, not a luxury. Agreeing to the test didn't bring relief. It brought a new kind of tension, one that sat with us constantly, filling the space between words. The waiting period was worse than I expected. Days stretched in ways I wasn't prepared for. There was no clear role for me to play during that time, no action that felt unquestionably right. I showed up when she asked. I stayed away when she needed space. Every decision felt like it carried meaning far beyond its surface. At night, sleep came in fragments. I'd lie awake listening to the house settle, my thoughts looping back to the same questions. What if the baby was mine? What if it wasn't? What did responsibility look like in each scenario? I realized how deeply I feared both answers for different reasons. One meant a lifetime of connection, shaped by uncertainty. The other meant walking away from something that had already left its mark on me. In the quiet moments, my internal monologue grew louder. I replayed conversations, searched for missed clues, wondered who I would blame when the truth arrived. Her, myself, circumstance. I thought about how easily trust erodes when certainty is delayed, and how waiting can be its own form of punishment. We spoke less during that time, not out of anger, but exhaustion. When we did talk, it was practical, stripped of emotion, as if naming feelings might break whatever balance we'd managed to hold. I remember sitting alone one night, staring at my phone, realizing how much power a single email held over my future. And when the results finally came back, when the results arrived, my hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the envelope. I remember staring at it for a full minute, unable to tear it open, as if the act itself would make the truth unbearable. Finally, I slid the paper out, unfolded it slowly, and read the words. The test confirmed it. I was the father. Relief should have come, or joy, or some kind of celebration. But instead, there was only a weight, the full measure of what that meant. Not just biology, not just responsibility, but the reality of a life now irrevocably linked to another human being. Every choice I had made in the last months, every moment of hesitation, every night of sleepless doubt, came rushing back at once. I felt fear, awe, and an unexpected tenderness all at the same time. This wasn't a hypothetical anymore. This was real. Sarah's reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Her eyes were glossy, not from triumph or relief, but from the tension of carrying a secret, from the fear of letting herself fully hope. She didn't reach out, didn't smile, didn't speak. Her hands rested on her lap, shaking slightly, and we sat in silence that seemed louder than words could ever be. That silence held everything: apology, vulnerability, exhaustion, and the fragile weight of trust being rebuilt. I realized then that the facts, the medical proof, the timeline, the tests, were only part of the story. The emotional truth, the human truth, carried far more gravity. I didn't know how to react immediately. I didn't leap or hug or cry. I just breathed, letting the silence stretch between us, letting the enormity of the moment settle. I watched her face, taking in the small, vulnerable details. The way her shoulders slumped when she thought I wasn't looking, the slight tremor in her jaw. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped, leaving just the two of us, poised at the edge of something enormous and irreversible. Every fear, every doubt, every sleepless night led to this quiet confrontation with reality. And in that silence, I understood that being a father was more than a fact. It was a choice I would have to make every day from now on. After that moment, life didn't magically fall into place. There were no sweeping gestures, no cinematic reconciliation. Instead, we settled into a fragile rhythm, defined more by necessity than romance. I became a father in ways I hadn't anticipated, attending appointments, learning schedules, adjusting my life around someone else's heartbeat. Sarah and I remained in contact, careful, respectful, but the intimacy we once shared never fully returned. We weren't enemies, but we weren't the same people who had laughed together on the couch months before. The bond we had now revolved around responsibility, honesty where possible, and a shared commitment to the child rather than each other. Through it all, I learned more about myself than I ever expected. I discovered patience I didn't know I had. I discovered resilience, the kind that comes from holding steady when circumstances feel unsteady. I realized that love isn't always dramatic or romantic. It can be quiet, steady, and sometimes complicated by duty. And most of all, I realized that clarity doesn't always heal. Some truths don't fix things. They clarify them. They strip away illusions and force you to see what's real. That's what happened to me. I saw the situation, the people involved, and myself with an unflinching honesty I wouldn't have wanted at the start, but one I needed by the end. And in that clarity, though it wasn't perfect, I found a kind of peace, a recognition that life doesn't owe you simplicity, only the chance to respond with integrity. Looking back now, I see how much of this story isn't just about me, or Sarah, or even the baby. It's about the choices we make under pressure, the ways fear shapes decisions, and how trust and boundaries define the lives we lead. Forgiveness became a quiet, necessary act, not because what happened was easy to overlook, but because holding on to anger would have poisoned every future moment. I had to forgive myself for doubting, for hesitating, for allowing fear to creep into my judgment. And I had to forgive her, not to excuse her choices, but to understand them. Boundaries became just as important as forgiveness. Learning where to step in and where to step back defined not only my relationship with Sarah, but my role as a father. Self-respect demanded that I honor my own emotional needs while still showing up for someone else. I realized that doing the right thing doesn't always look the way we imagined. It's quieter, slower, and far more complicated. It's holding steady when circumstances feel unfair. It's staying present even when the path forward isn't clear. And it's choosing integrity over comfort every single day, even when no one else sees the effort behind it.so. Here's the question I'm leaving with you. Do you think love should come before truth or after it? When does honesty become more important than comfort? When does protection become a form of harm? I want you to reflect on that and tell me what you think. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or made you think about the choices we make under pressure, give it a like. And if you're new here, hit the subscribe button so you never miss stories like this, because these stories matter. They happen every day, in quiet kitchens, in living rooms, in lives much like our own.